Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2019, the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Case, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise as a proud member of the Democratic Blue Dog Coalition. For a quarter century, the Blue Dogs in Congress have focused on 3 missions: fiscal responsibility for our country, a strong national defense, and common sense solutions to practical problems. We are 27 proud Democrats with democratic values. Our individual views and votes on the broad range of issues that come before this Congress run the gamut, from progressive to moderate, centrist, and beyond. But together, we believe that the best way forward for our country on all of these issues is an underlying focus on fiscal responsibility, a strong national defense, and common sense solutions wherever they may be found to practical problems. Today, I wish to focus on fiscal responsibility. And I do so as co-chair with my colleague from Utah, Mr. McAdams, of the Blue Dog Task Force on Fiscal Responsibility and Government Reform. And let me start by saying, unfortunately and very directly, that it is very arguable that at no point in our entire history have we operated our federal government in as fiscally irresponsible a manner as we are operating it today. There's lots of indicia of this out there, but nowhere does this show up more directly and stare us straight in the face than our national debt. And let me say what that is. Our national debt is exactly what it sounds like. It is the amount that our federal government, you, owe to everyone who has loaned us money to pay for government. Why do we have to do that? Because we are not bringing into government the revenues that are sufficient to match and pay for what we are paying for out of expenses. And we are now operating at a chronic and exploding deficit, and we are borrowing with abandon to make up the difference. This particular chart is taken from the Congressional Budget Office. You will not find a more nonpartisan, objective, and professional group anywhere studying our fiscal responsibilities, our fiscal status, and our budgets than the Congressional Budget Office. I encourage everybody to take a look at their materials at cbo.org. This is just one of their many publications, and it's a wealth of information. CBO, the Budget and Economic Outlook, 2019 to 2029. They're not only responsible for what is happening today, what has happened, they're responsible for taking a look at the long term, as any one of us would want to do with our own budgets. And what this chart shows is outlays or spending on the top line and revenues on the bottom line. In this particular chart, we're matching outlays over time. The time frame here is about 15 years against gross domestic product, the percentage of gross domestic product. Why is that important? It is important because one could have outlays and revenues coming in, but the only way to match it up is how much is the strength of your economy overall. It's kind of like asking yourself, well, in my own household budget, what is my level of spending? What is my level of borrowing? What is my level of income as opposed to my overall financial situation? And so here we have the percentage of gross domestic product over on the left in the vertical axis, and down here time. And we can clearly see here that as we look out over a long, long period of time, and I correct myself, this is actually the CBO's projection out 30 years to 2049, that if we continued on the way we are today, we would see massive continuing spread of the two lines between expenses on the top and revenues at the bottom. And to amplify this situation, when we take a look at where we are currently, 2019, that dotted line right over here, that's about $1 trillion, that gap. $1 trillion. $1 trillion in 1 year of a deficit. And so, as we can see very obviously, not only are we in a very difficult situation today, but if we do nothing about it, it will spread over time. Now, what actually finances that difference? Debt. We go out and borrow it. It doesn't just arrive in the middle of the night in a unmarked bag. It doesn't just grow on the tree outside. We are operating at a chronic and exploding deficit and borrowing to make up this difference. I'm a returnee to Congress. I served in Congress from 2002 to 2007, so I tend to match up my experiences then versus now. And I had a 12-year absence in between, half a generation if you want to think about it. When I left Congress in early 2007, our national debt stood at $9 trillion. $9 trillion. Today, our national debt stands at $22 trillion. And by the way, if you want to have a harrowing view of something, take a look at usdebtclock.org and watch the numbers turn over about as rapidly as anything you can see. And what you can see from studying the debt over time is an incredible increase over here on the right side of this chart. But $22.5 trillion today, let's just think about that. That's $68,300 for each and every citizen of this country, $183,000 for each and every taxpayer. Really? 230 years in our country's history to get to national debt of $9 trillion. But just 12 years later, increasing by 250% to $22.5 trillion. Again, we can't just look at the absolute numbers because they don't tell the full story. After all, if we had a thriving economy that was producing an incredible amount of money, some of these figures wouldn't make as much sense. So let's again take the total debt against the total gross domestic product. Again, just like any house or business would do. And we can see here that if we chart total debt against GDP, again, on the far left side, on the vertical axis, we have GDP as a percent of GDP. And down here, we have a period that starts at the origins of our country and concludes in 2049. From the start of our country to 2049, you can see the peaks right here. Obviously, our country was in bad shape at the beginning in the Revolutionary War and thereafter. We were just starting out as a country. And you can see, for example, the Civil War, this peak. Wars are times when we have to borrow money. Wars are times that are very, very difficult for our economies, and obviously our expenses are up and people have needs. And during that period, we borrow money. And we always try, or have always tried, to pay it back down because we don't know when the next emergency will come along. We can see another peak here, World War I. We see the Great Depression right here, the Great Depression and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which was financed with borrowing. And then, of course, the tragedy of World War II, the absolute peak of our debt versus our gross domestic product right there. And why not? Our world was at war. Our economy was in a shambles. We had to finance that war. And not only did we finance that war, we financed the entire recovery of the world, the Marshall Plan. In so many ways, we rebuilt our cities. We built the national highway system. We incurred that largely through debt. This was the highest point of our debt to date. And we see again some peaks that were related to great recessions and downturns in our economy where we had to borrow for a little while and we came back down. And then we came to the last 15 to 20 years. Up until this point, we operated fairly responsibly. But 15 to 20 years, we abandoned fiscal responsibility. And we started down a road of accelerating debt. unrelated, for the most part, to wars, other than for Iraq and Afghanistan, which definitely had a consequence to our national debt, but mostly a result of a failure in this body and the administration to balance budgets as we went along. And now here we are in 2017 and 2018 and 2019, and what is more scary than anything else is the CBO's projection of where it's going over time, off the roof, straight up. We can see here that this is not a partisan issue. This particular graphs, again, percent of GDP over on the left axis, and then on the bottom vertical axis over time, in more recent history, the post-war period, by presidencies. We've got Democrats in blue and Republicans in red. We see over here President Truman in the late 40s had the high threshold of debt to GDP, little over 100%. And then, of course, it came down after that as we recovered. And it went up in the era of some of our great recessions and, of course, our wars. And then we had really the period when we did the best, which was an evolution from President Clinton's into President Bush, where we actually were the last time we actually balanced our budget. And then here's that spike, starting with President Bush and through the last presidency, and especially off the current presidency, into an ascending column that is a projection from, again, the Congressional Budget Office. These are scary projections because CBO projects that if we do nothing, we will see our debt climb to around 144% of GDP within a couple of decades. Now, where does that rank us in the world? Because after all, we have other governments that have had high debt. We've had other governments that have collapsed. We have other governments for which their budget problems have caught up with them. Let's take a look at that. This chart shows the period projected from the current year out only 5 years. And it asks the question, what is the growth in our debt to GDP as compared to the rest of the world? How fast are we growing in our debt versus the rest of the world? And unfortunately, the line on the right is us. We project that our debt to GDP will grow 11% over the next couple of years. The next line here is Italy, we've got Korea, we've got Japan, but the rest of the world seems to be getting their growth under control. Now, some of these countries are recovering from recessions, but some of these countries just have sound economic practices. The embarrassing thing about this chart, the scary thing about this chart, is we're not the world's leader, we're the world's loser in terms of controlling our national debt. Now, why should we care about all of this? One of the questions that's asked sometimes is, why does debt matter? Well, I think the first and foremost obvious answer is debt costs something. It's not free. You borrow money, you pay interest. That's what everybody that loans us money expects. They expect to be paid some interest. And these interest payments accelerate rapidly in times of accelerating debt. We see here a projection, again, based on figures from the Congressional Budget Office, of interest spending over time, the next 10 years in this particular case. And we see here that today we have interest of somewhere around $400 billion a year, but accelerating at a very rapid rate over the next decade, up to close to $1 trillion a year. And the red line is a scenario that is very likely if we do not actually make some tough decisions. So that gets us even higher. And so this is the actual trend that we're looking at. Now, that's a lot of money to be paying just for interest. To make matters worse, try to compare that level of interest spending against some of our other spending. In this particular chart, we see here, this line is our interest spending, kept relatively modest until recently, but then accelerating very rapidly, as was indicated in my prior chart, to the levels that are out 2029 and are truly scary. That's not the scary part, if that's not scary enough. This line here is our total spending on our children. So what do we do to take care of the children of our country? And that's our spending line. Interest is just crossing it right now. This is our total defense spending. Our total defense spending projected out over time with interest crossing over. So what this shows is that we're about to pay, in a very short period of time, if we don't do anything, far more money in basic interest on our national debt than we are spending on our children and on our defense. And that's an inexcusable situation for us to be in. So the first basic problem is we crowd out spending for other federal purposes, which forces us, by the way, to borrow more, which forces us to have higher debt, which forces us to pay more interest. Everybody that's been in a business or a personal situation knows this. Second basic problem with debt. Why should we care about debt? National security. Where does this money come from? Who is lending us this money? 2/5 of our interest payments go overseas. 2/5 of the people in this world who are loaning us money, 2/5 of our total debt, is loaned to us basically by other countries. And other countries here, 26%. But this is the line that scares you. China, up to 7% now, and growing. Japan, okay, fine. We welcome Japan loaning money to us, but on balance, I'd rather the blue be the blue, rather than owing the money to other countries, because who knows what's going to happen over the next 10 or 20 years or generations. And so this is obviously not just an issue of our own fiscal stability, but it is a question of national security. And another question of national security is we need this money in case we get into other situations in the world, hopefully not, but prepare for the situation where we may have to have massive increases in defense spending over the next generation. These are areas where we have traditionally tried to pay down our debt so that we can borrow back up to finance these additional expenditures without destroying our economy. And yet, when we borrow in good times to finance even larger federal spending, then we have very little safety net to be able to borrow in bad times. That's not just a matter of budgetary stability, that's a matter of national security. And then finally, why should we matter? Economic damage. Economists, most economists, there's a school out there that is trying to justify more debt, which is largely not agreed to by most economists, but most economists agree that over time, large levels of debt, large levels of interest payments drive up basic interest rates. They drive up basic interest rates, and that's bad for an economy. They drive up inflation, and that's bad for economy. They lead to a situation where the markets out there, the people that are loaning us money, the people that are relying on the United States for its full faith and credit, start to doubt our basic fiscal solvency, and they start to not only not loan us money, but they start to charge us more interest, and that causes an economic problem. And then finally, it's just bad budgetary practice to skate too closely on thin ice. So this is why we should care, because our interest payments are crowding our spending, because it's a national security issue, and because over time, it's an economic issue. How do we get into this mess? Well, obviously, we're spending more than we're taking in. Our long-term deficit buildup and short-term tax reduction and spending increases are really the issue. This chart is an illustration, again, based on CBO information, of where our deficits are coming from today. And when we're talking about the level of deficits, total amount of deficits of closing in on $1 trillion, we see that absent recent legislation, so we're talking about just the last 5 years or so, we had a chronic deficit going of close to $400 billion a year, which is pretty bad, since if you take $400 billion and times it by 5 years, all of a sudden you're at $2 trillion of debt. But then we made major mistakes from a fiscal responsibility perspective in the last few years. First of all, we had tax extenders that were not paid for. We'll get into that. So we had tax credits, tax reductions, tax rates that were extended without accounting on the other side for the spending. We had a major tax bill, which is still debated in this chamber as to whether it was the right idea or not. But what is indisputable about that tax bill was that it drove incredibly increasing deficits and incredibly rapidly increasing debt. And then finally, we had a budget agreement last year to raise the amount of spending. Now, there's nothing wrong with raising the amount of spending per se if it's a public judgment and a policy judgment that that's the best thing for our country. What is wrong is to pretend that there's no consequence to our deficit, to our debt, and to our national fiscal policy. So what do we do about it? And by the way, I just want to go back to that point for a second. We are not debating here whether our government should be bigger or smaller. We are not debating here whether taxes should be higher or lower. We can have that debate. It's been going on, after all, for 250 years, and even before that, back to the colonies. We've always talked about how big government should or shouldn't be, how much we should or shouldn't spend through government. We just had that debate here on this floor today. We've always talked about the overall level of taxes. Should they be higher? Should they be lower? Should we have high taxes to pay for spending? Should they be lower to generate economic growth? Those are good, solid policy decisions to be made. That's not what we are talking about here. What we are talking about here is the fiscal result when you don't balance your spending and your revenues. The result when you don't balance your spending and your revenues. So you can choose to have high spending, but if you don't generate the revenue for that, then you're gonna end up with incredible taxation. You can choose to have, incredible deficits in debt. You can choose to have lower taxes, but if you don't adjust the spending at the same time, you're gonna end up with high deficits in debt. It just makes perfect sense. And so that's all we are talking about here. We are willing and able to have the debate over the size of government and taxes. And again, within our Blue Dog Caucus, we have disagreements on that. But where we have a centralization of agreement is in managing the consequence of that debate and having it be an honest debate, not a debate that pulls the wool over our fellow citizens' eyes on the consequence. So what do we do about it? Well, I think, first of all, we start talking about it again. You know, it's really hard. 20 years ago, in the great times when we actually did balance the budget in the late 90s and the early 00s, public sentiment was high on deficits and debt. People cared about this. People understood the risk. And then all of a sudden, politicians stopped talking about it. They did, on both sides of the aisle, what many of us do when faced with a major issue. We deny it. We don't want to acknowledge it. It's too much trouble. We don't want to say that when we cut taxes and we don't adjust spending, that there's a consequence to our deficit and the debt. We don't want to say the reverse of that. And we want to tell everybody that everything's okay. After all, you can have your cake and eat it too. I don't want to go back to my district and say, well, you know, I can't vote for a tax reduction because it's going to blow our deficit and debt. This is an insidious situation. These things don't catch up. The consequences of deficits and debt are not apparent right out front. They don't catch up with you for a long time. But I think we all know deep down we have a problem and it's not true. And the second thing we have to do at some point is simply make a plan and implement it. And that's what our Democratic Blue Dog Coalition has done and will try to do going forward. We have tried to come up with a blueprint for fiscal responsibility, which today we endorsed and released. And these are a series of points that we believe need to be pursued in order to have some chance at fiscal responsibility and sustainability over time. And from that perspective, I'm very pleased that I'm joined today by my colleague from Utah, Mr. McAdams, my co-chair of the Blue Dog Task Force on Fiscal Responsibility and Government Reform, to share his views and to outline some of our agenda items. I yield.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Case, for organizing this special order today. And thank you for your outstanding work as co-chair of the Blue Dogs Fiscal Responsibility and Government Reform Task Force. I'm lucky to serve alongside you as co-chair, and I also want to thank Stephanie Murphy for her tireless leadership in Congress and with the Blue Dogs. Madam Speaker, Washington has an addiction problem. It's hooked on deficits and it is hooked on debt. And our entire nation and our children and their children will pay the price for this addiction. On March 2nd, 2019, the debt limit was reinstated at $22 trillion, as Representative Case so appropriately outlined. And to operate the government at that limit, the Treasury Department deployed extraordinary measures, accounting maneuvers, allowing government operations to continue. But if those measures run out and our cash reserves are depleted, the federal government would reach the unprecedented day on which our federal government cannot meet all its obligations in full and on time. The consequences of defaulting on our obligations are unknown, but could be economically devastating, not only for the United States, but globally. As Fed Chairman Jerome Powell said recently about the prospect of not raising the debt limit, it's beyond even considering that the United States would not honor all its obligations and pay them when due. It is just something that can't even be considered, he said. We know that the costs of barreling towards this fiscal cliff are already mounting. American taxpayers foot the bill for additional borrowing costs that come from delays in extending the debt limit. In previous years, uncertainty has caused interest rates on some Treasury bills to spike in anticipation of going over the fiscal cliff, resulting in many millions, if not billions of dollars in added interest costs. As we've done more than 100 times, we are now preparing to vote to raise the debt limit. Raising it does not authorize new spending. It enables the government to pay its bills and avoid the sorry reality of becoming an untrustworthy borrower. What better time to pair that vote with a plan to reform government spending? It's not as if we woke up this morning to suddenly face this fiscal calamity. It has been building for decades, as we just saw. Both parties and Republican and Democratic administrations have contributed to the problem. The question is, what are we going to do about it, and when will we start to get our borrowing and our spending addiction under control? The Blue Dog Coalition, of which I am a proud member, has a well-deserved reputation for talking the talk and walking the walk when it comes to fiscal responsibility. Look at the Blue Dog priorities on fiscal responsibility, and you will see a comprehensive list of pragmatic steps that we can take, some of which we have already taken. For example, Blue Dogs support the House pay-go rules. It is one of the first things the Blue Dogs fought for when we got sworn in this year, and I was pleased to see the House keep pay-go rules. We don't want those rules to be waived, but if they are, there should be a vote held on a waiver. Blue Dogs support a constitutional amendment to require a balanced budget every year except in times of war, in times of national emergency or recession. I was proud that my first bill introduced in this Congress was this exact balanced budget amendment that the Blue Dogs have endorsed. We want to return to regular order, passing a budget every year and on time, and avoiding omnibus appropriation packages that do not align with that budget. As a former mayor myself, who had to balance a budget every year and do so in a bipartisan fashion, I was then, as I am now, accountable to the taxpayers for every dollar we spend. Do elected officials face tough trade-offs? Yes, absolutely. That comes with the job. Just as hardworking families and small business owners must do, you must work together, and we in Congress must work together to set priorities and make sure the checkbook balances at the end of each month. It's important that we fully offset the cost of all new spending or reductions in fiscal revenues with spending cuts or revenue increases. We must make those tough choices. We need strict enforceable spending caps to ensure a fiscally responsible budget. The Blue Dogs also support better oversight over our government spending. The Government Accountability Office, or GAO, and the Inspectors General are important entities throughout the federal government that hold federal agencies accountable to taxpayers and recommend improvements. We believe that Congress should know what it is voting on by having every conference report and bill that comes to the floor of the House accompanied by a cost estimate prepared by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, and that should be done at least 24 hours in advance of the floor vote. We believe that committees should identify proper and related offsets before the legislation is reported out of committee. A $22 trillion debt burden is a heavy lift to eliminate, for sure. But at the very least, we should be able to agree not to take on new policies that add to that debt. We teach our kids that if they want something badly enough, they need to figure out how to pay for it. Tax reform should be deficit neutral. Spending plans should be fully paid for. Even emergency spending, which should be passed quickly to respond when our communities need it most, should include a plan to pay for it. And we can think ahead and plan ahead for those emergencies. We should get away from the ad hoc spending, emergency spending, and figure out how to establish a rainy day fund, which 45 states currently have. Every man, woman, and child in America owes $68,000, as Representative Case has highlighted, as their share of the national debt. We will all be morally bankrupt as well as financially bankrupt if we don't stop kicking the can down the road and make future generations liable for our lack of fiscal discipline today. And so my colleagues often ask me why deficits matter. My answer is because future generations will be forced to bear the burden of our failure if we don't act today. And the longer it takes for us to act, the more difficult those decisions become. The cost of paying interest on our debt is the fastest growing part of the budget. We will spend more on interest than on defense by the year 2025. That's 6 years from now. Let that sink in. The government is projected to spend $383 billion on interest payments for its debt this year alone. This year, $383 billion. So why do I care about the debt and deficits? It's because a strong fiscal house means we have a stronger country. That $383 billion spent on interest payments on our debt is $383 billion we can't spend on other priorities, such as clean energy and transportation and affordable health care. The interest we pay on the debt is simply going onto our credit card. It is becoming part of the debt. So if you care about health care, if you care about climate change and building a 21st century infrastructure system, if you care about affordable housing and any other investment that the government can make, then I urge you, care about the debt and care about our deficits. Because every dollar spent on paying down the debt and its deficits or interest on that debt is one more dollar that could have been invested in priorities that strengthen our country, that strengthen our national defense, and strengthens the American people. It is clear we are on a dangerous and unsustainable course. The decisions will not be easy, but our children and our grandchildren are counting on us to make this right. We were elected to make tough decisions. Thank you. I yield back to Representative Case.
Thank you so much to the gentleman, and I'm privileged to be your co-chair. And would you engage me in a colloquy on a few of the issues that you touched upon?
I'd be happy to. Thank you,
Okay,
Representative
thank you
Case.
so much. Well, first of all, let's talk about your proposed balanced budget amendment, by the way, of which I am a co-sponsor, a proud co-sponsor. Now, some people criticize the balanced budget amendment, which would have to be ratified throughout our country, as a overly restrictive mechanism, especially in times of national emergency. As your balanced budget amendment is crafted, is there flexibility to borrow money and to deficit spend in times of genuine national need?
Yes, absolutely. We recognize that there may be emergencies that are unforeseen and unplanned for. And in those cases, the language of my proposed amendment would allow for deficit spending to help our communities in times of need, in times of natural disaster or other emergencies. And I think that's important.
So we always have the ability to override the basic provisions of that balanced budget amendment in Congress where we believe that we do have to borrow that money. This is just a mechanism to introduce the same fiscal discipline that a well-run business or household has to follow.
That is correct.
As by the way, is the case with 49 out of 50 of our states who either have a similar balanced budget amendment in their constitution or by statute.
That is correct. And my own state of Utah, that has a balanced budget requirement, has established a rainy day fund, as I mentioned, such that when those emergencies arise, they have funds available to account for that. And I would urge us to not only have that flexibility built into the language of the amendment, but to plan ahead. We know, while we don't know what the next emergency will be or where it will strike, we know that dark days are ahead of us and that there will be natural disasters and other emergencies, and we should plan ahead for those.
And then you made reference to the fact that you were a mayor, and I made the comment to you once, and I believe it, that of all of the public officials I've ever worked with throughout the country, I think mayors understand fiscal responsibility the best. And how you made reference to the fact that you functioned under a balanced budget as a mayor. Was there any magic to doing that? I mean, how did you do that? You had a requirement, so what did you do?
Well, one of the things, I had a council of 9 members. 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And one thing I know from experience is balancing budgets are hard. We have to make really tough choices. There are certainly things that may not be meritorious expenses that are easy to say no to, but by and large, we have to make some really tough decisions. We can't do it all, even though we might want to do it all. You cannot do it all. And what it takes is, first of all, having a relationship, a bipartisan relationship, where people put their priorities on the table, discuss what they want to accomplish and how they want to get there. And then you have to continue to work together to refine proposals, to make sure that every proposal, you cut the fat out of proposals and make sure that they are as well refined and every dollar spent is justified. And ultimately, we've been able to balance a budget. We have to make tough decisions, but we're able to balance a budget because there's that expectation and requirement that we must get there. And so we do get there.
Well, and to that point, my experience in Hawaii, where we've had a balanced budget for a long, long time, and I was a state legislator, so I had knockdown, drag-out fights over all this kind of stuff, whether it be increased spending or tax reductions or tax increases. But it was always against the backdrop that it had to balance. And my sense was always that the folks that we represented understood that presented us as a series of tough choices, and they understood that in the big picture, the tough choices that we had to make as a result of a balanced budget were for the better overall long-term big picture physical health and economic health and social health of Hawaii. Did you have that experience in Utah?
We did have that experience, and I would add, it made us better. The county that I presided over as mayor, we had a AAA bond rating. So we were able to not only the faith in our ability to pay our debts meant we paid lower interest rates. People knew that we would not default on those debts, and we saved tax dollars because people knew that we could balance our budget. And I'd like to add one point to your considerations. Fiscal responsibility is important. It's important for our states. It's important for this country. But another element that I found in the process of balancing a budget, when we had to make those tough choices, when at the end of the day the ledger had to balance, what we were forced to do is go back and look at every expenditure we made and ask ourselves, can it be done more effectively? Can we stretch our dollars further? Is the program or endeavor that we're engaged in the lowest cost alternative? Our tax dollars being spent wisely? Our programs invested in our citizens, whether it's a program to reduce recidivism, to improve early childhood learning. We were expected to look and evaluate the effectiveness in each and every program because we were having to make competing choices, and we were choosing between one good and hopefully a better good. And that required us to quantify empirically the outcomes we were receiving from our programs. That was good for fiscal responsibility, but more importantly, it was good for the people we were serving because the programs we were delivering were expected to improve and to always we held those programs to a high standard on behalf of the citizens that we served.
I think what you're saying in a very gracious Utah way is that the lack of a balanced budget, where you always have the recourse to just borrow money and kick some cans down the road, disincentivizes the efficient and effective expenditure of government funds, of taxpayer funds, because after all, if there's waste in that expenditure, there's a safety valve there, whereas a balanced budget drives a certain discipline.
And waste is in plowing snow or fixing streetlights is one thing, but in programs that serve our residents, there's a human cost to programs that aren't held to a high standard. And it takes a toll on individuals, on families, on people who are promised one outcome with a program that fails to deliver on that outcome. There's a human cost.
Okay. And then one other point that you made that I think bears a further discussion, a quick discussion, is you referenced PAYGO. And of course, we throw PAYGO around here all of the time. And sometimes people's eyes, kind of blank out when you talk about PAYGO. Can you just talk a little bit more about the simplistic, the basic approach at PAYGO? What does that actually mean? What is its effect in the work that we do?
So the rules of the House require that any legislation that would have a fiscal impact has to be paid for. We can't simply add that onto the tab, put it on the taxpayer's credit card, that every legislation has to be paid for up front. And
in other words, not financed by additional
debt
in order to drive, and which would have the result of driving up the deficit and the debt and interest payments.
That's exactly right. I describe it as saying when you first rule, when you find yourself in a hole and you're not sure how to get out, stop digging.
Right. And so let's just take a pretty straightforward example. Let's say that we wanted to reduce taxes. PAYGO would say that in order to make taxes budget neutral, and by the way, we can acknowledge there's a debate about whether reducing taxes does in fact generate revenue or not. But for these purposes, and especially the recent large tax cut, we simply did not see a return on revenues from those tax cuts. But let's just stick with the fact, if you reduce taxes, then you've got to either increase another tax and or reduce government spending somewhere to be able to have a budget neutral, a deficit neutral outcome. Is that correct?
That's right. Every activity, whether it's reducing revenues or increasing spending, should be neutral as it relates to the federal deficit.
Okay. And then conversely, if we want to increase federal spending, we've either got to reduce some other federal spending or reduce or increase taxes, correct? And
that's
so,
correct.
Hey, you said that the House rules already provide for PAYGO, so why are we here so concerned about it?
Well, I think one of my concerns is the willingness with which both sides, both parties, will waive PAYGO. And it takes a simple majority to waive PAYGO, and we've seen that happen from time to time, whether it's exigent circumstances like emergencies, but other things that we can plan ahead and we should look ahead for.
So essentially we have a rule that's honored in the breach.
Yes.
And of course, this is one of the elements of our Blue Dog fiscal responsibility blueprint, is to tighten up the rules on PAYGO so that we actually do stop the bleeding on debt and deficit spending.
Exactly.
Well, I thank you very much. Again, I'm honored to be your co-chair, and I thank you for adding to our debate today.
Thank you, Representative Case.
I want to make one other point before I close on this subject, and I wanted to emphasize one of the points made by my colleague from Utah. He talked about restoring the budget and appropriations process. Now, this starts to be real inside baseball. The process by which Congress goes through establishing a budget, which is the overall outline of federal spending for the next year, because we do everything on a yearly basis for the most part, and then passing appropriations bills that are consistent with that budget. In other words, we make the big picture decision up front in a budget, and then we have our appropriations bills which must match that budget. And in what we refer to here as regular order, what we would do is we would first have a budget resolution which passes the House, passes the Senate, is agreed to by both of the House and the Senate, so we know what our roadmap is. And then we would take each of the areas of government that needs appropriations every year, and there are, the way we do it, 12 separate appropriations bills, and we would individually pass each of those bills, consistent with the budget. And we would do all of that by October 1st, which is when our fiscal year starts. And we would call that regular order. And that would be quite regular order for any business, any personal budget. The last time we followed regular order was 1995. The last time we went through a full budget process and individual appropriations bill process was 1995. And that has simply thrown our federal fiscal house into disarray. We saw that with an incredibly tragic, unnecessary federal government shutdown just late last year and earlier this year. That was in part to be laid at the feet of our failure to follow basic budgetary and fiscal and appropriations procedures. We have tried on a bipartisan basis to fix this. In fact, just last year, we had a bicameral, bipartisan committee set up to reform the rules of the House and the Senate as to the budget and the appropriations process. And I want to read just a passage from that committee's report. This was the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate. And here is a quote from the committee's report in late 2018. There have been numerous breakdowns in the budget process in recent decades. Fiscal year 1995 was the last time Congress passed a conference report on the budget resolution, followed by passage of 13 separate appropriations bills before the beginning of the new fiscal year. We now do 12. Continuing resolutions, CRs, have become the status quo for funding the federal government, demonstrating Congress's failure to complete its work on time. CRs create uncertainty for agencies and the American people. And by the way, I stopped to describe a CR as a resolution that says, sorry, we can't figure out what to do in this next fiscal year for that fiscal year. So while we're trying to figure it out, all we're going to do is continue the spending the way it was in the last fiscal year. No adjustment of spending levels, no adjustment of priorities, no update for current situations. Let's just kick this can down the road. That's a CR. Back to the report. In many years, there has been concern that parts of the government would have to shut down due to the failure to enact even stopgap appropriations. And shutdowns of various durations have actually occurred. In the 115th Congress alone, the most recent Congress, there have been 2 government shutdowns. Whether it was federal employees being furloughed, national parks shutting down, adverse effects on defense and law enforcement, shutdowns inflict severe damage and uncertainty on the nation's fiscal state. Additionally, multiple members of this committee expressed frustration regarding the lack of legislative tools available for Congress to address national needs or the national debt in a bipartisan manner. The committee's report was submitted very, very late in the last Congress, so there was really not enough time to debate it fully and to proceed. But the report certainly remains highly relevant, together with recommended legislation. And our Blue Dog committee believes that reform along those lines is necessary. Finally, and I don't speak now for the Blue Dogs, but I do speak for myself and I believe many individual Blue Dogs and perhaps others. We have another mechanism available to us, a mechanism that we shouldn't have to follow, but sometimes may be the only way to cut through the political dialogue and the fears of people to make tough decisions. And that is to develop independent commissions outside Congress of experts, hopefully on a neutral basis, hopefully on a nonpartisan, bipartisan basis, who are charged with reviewing and making decisions on revenue and spending matters and reporting their results back to Congress, hopefully for an up or down vote. Because if Congress gets the opportunity to pick at a report, a balanced report once it comes back, then it defeats the purpose of the commission to start with. Simpson-Bowles was one very well-known commission which failed, and there have been others. But it is certainly conceivable that if we can't get our act in order in Congress, as we should be able to do, as I believe the American people want and think we should do, then we need to resort to some other mechanism to get this House in order. Finally, we need public support. We need to get people involved again in this issue. As I said earlier, the late 1990s and the early 2000s were the height of public concern over deficits and debt. And it resulted in external pressure to Congress to balance our budget. and a succession to presidents with bipartisan Congresses, by the way, got it balanced. The public demanded it, we delivered. Now, it's a forgotten issue almost. It doesn't even rank in the top 10 of major issues. We have many, many major issues. But I'll tell you one thing, the issues that are in the top 10, our solutions to those issues will be crippled if we don't get our basic fiscal house in order. So in conclusions, the Blue Dogs believe that we are, in fact, in a national crisis. We stand ready to work with anyone and everyone towards common sense, mainstream solutions. Thank you very much. I yield back.